Ele foi considerado por revistas e jornais econômicos como uma das personalidades mais influentes do mundo dos negócios. Trabalhou como consultor com algumas das maiores empresas do mundo. Atualmente é professor da London Business School. First question, Gary, comes from the title of your book. What matters now?
Well, I think there are 5 things that I'll be very brief that matter now. I think, first of all, values matter more than ever before. I think around the world, capitalism is on trial. I think by and large, by the way, the problem is not with capitalism, but with a few capitalists. But as people around the world have looked at large organizations, I think they're increasingly anxious, distrustful of power in business and also power in government. And I think we're on a cusp of really a deep sea change there, because the web has empowered individuals as never before. It makes every instance of corporate malfeasance visible around the world. So people are holding companies to higher ethical standards, and I think that's appropriate. But as a leader, as a manager, and executive, we really have a choice. If we don't fully step up to these new ethical responsibilities, we will have more and more rules imposed upon us as business people. So we really have this choice of whether we have a rules-based control system or a values-based system. And I would argue we need the latter. That's the way we preserve the dynamism, the enthusiasm of capitalism. But capitalism has to become much more socially accountable than it's been.
Let's explore a little more this issue. How to face this capitalist crisis?
Well, I think a new ethic is required, and I think, you know, I don't believe that this generation of leaders is somehow less ethical than the generation that's come before, but I think other things have changed. First of all, as I said, the web now makes any kind of corporate mistake so visible. There are no dark corners on the web. There's no place to hide. If you have some suicides at a supplier in Asia, 20 years ago, no one would have known. Today, even if that's not your company, you have to send in a team, you have to audit them, you have to take responsibility for that. I would say, number 2, as organizations have become larger through global consolidation, their choices are much more consequential. So people expect that these large organizations should be held to a higher standard. I think that's fair. And then thirdly, I think you have a kind of an emerging global consciousness, again, thanks to the web, where we realize that we breathe the same water, we live on the same planet, the same environment, we expect the same standards of work to apply around the world. And so I think ethical standards are, in a sense, leveling up, but that hasn't necessarily happened inside of most organizations. If we don't kind of raise the ethical caliber in our companies, if we don't think about the moral capital as well as our physical capital in companies, then I think we're likely to find ourselves more and more constrained. You already see this around the world. You see it in banking, more and more rules, more and more regulation. So for sure, capitalism is going to be bound. The only question is, do we bound it with our own values, our sense of ethics, or do we wait for the regulators and the legislators to bind us in a way that diminishes the ability of capitalism to grow new businesses, to reallocate resources, and so on, which I think is critical.
You said that management was one of the best inventions of last century, but nowadays it's stopped evolving. Could you explain that?
Well, I think so. And you know, human prosperity has been hugely driven over the last 100 years by innovations in management. How do you bring people together to do things at scale? All the scientific innovation wouldn't matter at all if we couldn't somehow produce these products and services in ways that were affordable to every human being around the world. Having said that, my argument is management is also becoming an impediment to organizational success. You know, a lot of folks forget, you know, that management really as a discipline, as a technology, is only about 100 years old. Of course, we've had kind of hierarchical structures back to the Roman army and the pyramids, but modern management, about 100 years old. And it was built to solve a very particular problem. It was built essentially to turn human beings into semi-programmable robots, because you needed people who were as reliable and as precise as the machines. And so, in a way, management was invented to drive the variability out of organizations. We wanted people to conform to work rules, to quality standards, to schedules, and so on. That was a huge accomplishment, and yet today we find ourselves in this world where wealth creation and growth comes from the irregular people with irregular ideas, creating irregular products and services that produce irregular profits. So we have a management system that was all driven to are all designed to ensure conformance and alignment and control. And now suddenly we're in a world where you still need that, but now you need the creativity and the imagination, the initiative, and we're going to have to reinvent management so we can have both of these things in our organizations. So control and alignment and conformance don't always win.
How the traditional company structure can cope with all these challenges?
Well, I think, how do you reinvent a very complex social technology like management is a challenging question. It certainly won't happen all at once. If you go back and you think about the invention of what I might call management 1.0, that essentially happened over about 25 years or so, from 1890 to about 1915. And if you were living in most parts of the world in 1890, it was still an agrarian economy. The average manufacturing company would have had 4 or 5 employees. And yet, 25 years later, Ford was making 500,000 automobiles a year. U.S. Steel had a market capitalization of $1 billion. And in literally a very short period of time, most of modern management was invented. Pay for performance, task design, divisionalization, budgeting. And I think we're now on the cusp of a similar revolution that is being driven by a lot of new challenges that are facing business around the world, is being driven by a lot of new tools that we have, principally from the web, so new ways of organizing, bringing people together, and then also by the expectations of a new generation that's coming to work. If just 10 years ago we had asked the average chief executive around the world whether they believed that in a few years it would be possible for a group of volunteers with almost no management structure to build something as complex as a computer operating system with millions of lines of code, most managers would have said that is impossible to do without the traditional management system, the hierarchy, the organization, the control, the project management. And of course, here comes the open source movement, open innovation. At the moment, there are about 300,000 open source projects around the world, about 3 million people contributing, and they are creating enormously complex things without any managers at all. So I think, we have to get our heads around these new possibilities. All of us as human beings, we are prisoners of the familiar. And most of us grew up in and have been around these traditional hierarchical structures for all of our life, at school, at church, the government, in the workplace. And it's very hard to imagine other ways of coordinating, controlling, bringing human beings together that are not based on that old model. But when you look at the web and you look at a few of these vanguard companies, you start to see that, yes, there really is an alternative.
To open more space to freedom of the workers inside the companies is a hard task to old model structure, isn't it?
Well, I think it's very hard because, in a way, we've had an assumption that in an organization, discipline and freedom are mutually exclusive, that you can have one without another, you can't have one and the other both, that somehow they're always in competition. And to an extent that's true, but I would argue that you can have both if you're creative about how you get control. I mean, let me give you a very simple example from a company in Brazil. It's a company that's organized into small profit centers, small businesses. Each business would have 30 or 40 employees. A lot of their compensation is tied to the profitability of that business. Well, a few years ago, they got rid of all of their controls on travel. And they said, every employee, anytime you want to travel on business, you don't have to ask any permission. Fly on any airline you like, first class, no problem. Stay in any hotel, whatever you want to eat, to drink, it's fine. And they got rid of all of their auditors, all the people who are watching and controlling these travel budgets. Well, what they did instead is, now when you come back from your trip, they take all of your expenses and they put them up online so all of your colleagues can see them. So if you came back with a big order and you had a nice bottle of champagne, nobody complains. If the business is losing money and you had only a bottle of beer, someone may say, we can't afford that. Next time you have to stick to water. So the control is still there, but in that case, the control comes from my peers, the people around me, and from the transparency, everybody knows, rather than one supervisor or a senior executive. So the question is not, do we get control, but can we get it in ways that don't force you to sacrifice the freedom and the accountability that I think is critical if you want people to innovate, if you want them to be truly engaged.
Do you think the old structure of control has to move to another type of control, like peers control?
I think that's very true. And you know, we saw this in the financial crisis. So let me share a little bit of data. Between 2001 and 2008, the value of the outstanding credit default swap contracts around the world, which were behind the financial meltdown, the value of those contracts rose from a few $100 million to more than 60 trillion US dollars. So you think about that, I mean, almost nothing in human history has grown at that kind of rate. And the dilemma, in a world where many things are changing much more rapidly, the top-down control systems don't work. So if I'm in a bank and I have a risk management function, or I'm a regulator and I'm watching these banks, by the time I realize what has happened, someone has already blown up the global economy. So that old top-down, you know, audit, measure, then put in the rules, that system is too slow to respond to the pace of change. What I need instead is people who have that internal sense of control, who have that responsibility to behave ethically, who have, you know, who are responsible for the impact their decisions are going to have on the profitability of that business, and who are held accountable, held to account. So that control has to come more from within and more from around, and no longer simply from above, because those traditional control systems are not nimble enough, not fast enough in a world where change is shaken rather than stirred. It just can't keep up.
Nós estamos conversando com Gary Hamel sobre os novos desafios para a gestão de empresas hoje. Nós voltamos logo depois do intervalo. Nós estamos conversando com Gary Hamel. Ele foi considerado por revistas e jornais econômicos como uma das personalidades mais influentes do mundo dos negócios. So, Gary, do you think the financial crisis, 2008 crisis, was a proof that the old scheme of control is not working anymore?
I think so, but we've seen a lot of other crises. It's not just the financial services crisis. We've seen a lot of ethical crises, I think, around the world in business. We saw a sale of wireless spectrum in India recently that was marred by corruption. This is not unique to any part of the world or any particular industry, but as I said, I do think it points us to the need for a new sense of ethical responsibility. You know, there's been a debate recently around whether corporations are really people and they have all the rights of individuals. And my argument is they are not people. They do not have, in the words of, you know, the U.S. Constitution, they do not have inalienable rights granted to them by their creator. Corporations are social constructions, and society can rewrite those rules, rewrite the contract anytime they like. And you see a lot of pressure today from all kinds of groups, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or environmental groups, saying we are dissatisfied with the traditional contract between these corporations and society. We are going to hold you more accountable for your impact on your environment, for your labor practices around the world, for your impact on human health. And I think, you know, society has a right to hold business to account. So yes, the old control systems, you know, were rule-based. The rules were always written after the crisis. And so the fire brigade arrived after the house was burned down. That's simply not good enough anymore. And I think it is changing, and it will change. And I think the companies that win are going to be the ones that recognize this and start to really take a leadership role rather than being pushed into it or forced into it.
Biggest Brazilian companies are commodity exporters, iron ore, soybeans, etc. Do you think innovation is also key for them?
You know, I think, interestingly, every business around the world is now a creative business. Because even in those commodity businesses, the differential between, you know, commodity profits, average profits, and extraordinary profits is going to be innovation. Now, that innovation isn't always on the demand side. It's not always around the product. That innovation can also be on the cost side. There's no way to outperform your competitors financially unless you out-innovate them. And I think that applies in organizations of every type and every size. Indeed, the only way to escape the curse of commoditization is through innovation. And I think often in companies, we've had almost a kind of creative apartheid. And we've had a belief that there are a few people who are very creative, but most people are not. And of course, you know, the great insight that Toyota had all of those years ago was that you can teach people how to be creative problem solvers. You know, in a typical year in Japan, Toyota will get 500,000 suggestions for improvement from their frontline employees. And, you know, obviously that's not enough, but that's where you have to start. You have to start by training every employee to be an innovator, creating opportunities for them to share those ideas, creating opportunities for them to get the experimental capital they need to work with those ideas and actually test them out. And very few companies have put this effort in yet. You know, the analogy I would give you is this. Over the last decade, most companies around the world have spent a lot of time reinventing their business processes for efficiency. So their supply chain, their logistics, their customer service, they've put those things up on the web. They have these ERP, enterprise resource planning systems, CRM, you know, they have all of these systems, all the technology. Now what we need to do is reinvent our management systems for innovation. So that means looking at the way we train people, what kinds of people we hire, how we promote people, how we allocate our capital. But if the things that get in the way of innovation in a company, it's not the supply chain, it's not your logistics, it's all of these management systems that reward conformance, reward discipline, reward control, but don't encourage innovation, don't encourage risk-taking, don't encourage experimentation. And so that is something that has to be done systematically. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes a CEO who's going to be there for the long run. It takes hard work.
Another idea from your blog is to empower the renegades. It sounds revolutionary or dangerous. How could it work?
You know, it's already happening. If you look around the world, basically the web is creating an unprecedented shift of power from institutions to individuals. So those renegades are there, and today they have a voice, right? In the old days, management controlled the conversation. No longer. If employees are not talking inside of the firewall, they'll be on Facebook talking to each other, or they'll be talking somewhere else and tweeting back and forth. So I think the only question is, how do you give those people a productive voice? I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, I was talking to one of the world's largest consumer goods companies. I won't mention the name, but they had all of their senior marketing people together from all over the world, 100 and more countries, about 400 people, for a kind of top management meeting. Now, in the old days, those people would have gotten together, there would have been disagreements and agreements, but at the end of that meeting, somebody would have written kind of a formal report, here's what happened, and announced it as if there was a lot of consensus and everybody, you know, is on the same page. What this company did in this meeting is, first of all, they streamed that meeting live to the whole worldwide organization. So anybody who wanted to come see what was going on could see it. Number two, they invited in about 20 young people who are very good with Twitter. And these kids, through the whole meeting, were tweeting. And these were all aggregated. Also, you could go and see all of the tweets. So almost once a minute, a new tweet is coming up. As these people are like, this is rubbish, I don't agree, or this is brilliant. And so you could not only see this meeting, but you could see this instant reaction of these young folks, the internal rebels, the next generation of leadership, as they were reacting to these ideas real time. Because today, you know, no longer can any leader rely on their position. People have very little respect for authority. They will follow you only if you have ideas that are worth following, only if you are willing to empower them. And you know, it's an idea you find on the web in a very interesting way. There's a lot of hierarchy on the web. Wherever you go to discussion forum, you'll see some people who've posted more often. You know, they have higher ranking in terms of the quality of their posts. And within the whole world of social media, some people have more influence than others. But on the web, all of these hierarchies are built bottom up. So if I have influence on the web, it's because people want to follow me, because they think I have something worthwhile to say, I'm adding value. And the moment I stop adding that value, my influence starts to wane, starts to disappear. So I think this next generation, when they come to work, they know that there's some people who have more expertise, more wisdom, have more to add, but they don't think that that correlates with a formal hierarchy. And they believe that every hierarchy should be built bottom up by virtue of your service to the community rather than because somebody appointed you as a leader. So managers and leaders, we're going to have to learn to live in this new reality where every idea is going to have the chance to compete on an equal footing. Nobody is going to give my idea more credibility simply because I'm a senior vice president or I'm a director. And if you're not willing to lead and work in that world, then you need to get out, because that's the world that's coming, and the next generation is going to insist on that.
As understood, internet tools are key for the new model of management, aren't they?
Well, you know, interestingly, the web already has the characteristics that we need to build into our organizations. The web is very adaptable. It's a platform for innovation. It is very engaging and inspiring to people, and our organizations don't really have those capabilities. So I think the web tools are key, but I think even more than the tools, you have to look at what are the principles underlying the web. Because I would argue that if management was the most important social innovation of the 20th century, the web is the most important social innovation of the 21st. But they're built on completely different principles, even different ideologies. Control on one hand, freedom on the other. Standardization, specialization, alignment, conformance, that was management. The web, transparency, freedom, meritocracy, collaboration, mashability, the ability to combine quickly different things. So I think the real challenge for management going forward is not so much to use the web tools, which of course are valuable, but you also have to say, what are the fundamental principles that have made the web so adaptable, so innovative, and how do we take those principles and weave them into our organizations? So that could be as simple as when you sit down, you know, next year you sit down to do your planning, you know, open your planning process up to every single employee. An Indian company I know, HCL Technologies, in their last planning round, they had 8,000 employees commenting on the company's strategies. It used to be strategy was something a few people did, kind of off in the dark. I used to say that the strategy process was like sex, a few people, you know, in the dark somewhere. Now it has to be like a family picnic where it's open and everybody has the chance to share their ideas. So taking those principles one at a time and saying, if we want to be more open, more transparent, more meritocratic, more collaborative, what do we change in the way we hire, in the way we promote, in the way we measure, in the way we plan? That for me is now the critical work. Leading is less and less about making the big decisions and more about being a social architect and thinking about how you create the social environment in which people are motivated to contribute. They find ways of collaborating without centralization, without hierarchy, and that's going to require, you know, maybe a new generation of leaders, but for sure, if you're a leader today and you're over about 30 years old, you better make sure that you have some young people who are mentoring you. You need to spend a lot of time on the web, understanding how these new social technologies are changing expectations. Think about how do you leverage them creatively inside of your business. Because I think this is, you know, those tools and those principles are the fulcrum on which we are going to see management change.
Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
Pleasure. Management.com. And